tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
As I mentioned on the show yesterday, I am on the road this week, hence the unusual environment from which I am broadcasting. I'm in the nation's capital of Ottawa. And after the show yesterday, I decided to take a little bit of a walk around, went down by the Parliament buildings, and I was there at the moment that question period had ended. And why that's significant is because I was out in front of West Block in that building, which is, well, as the name suggests, on the west side of the parliamentary precinct. And a bunch of members of Parliament were coming out, cabinet ministers, Justin Trudeau, I think he snuck out a back door, but all of these people, these very important people in Canada's government and Parliament were there. And when you come out, you walk south towards Wellington Street, which you may be familiar with as the center, the epicenter of the Freedom Convoy protests a couple of years back. But yesterday, there was a different type of truck on Wellington Street at that exact spot, this serendipitous moment I snapped a picture of. Let's throw that up there for those watching. Ah, yes, no one wants to freeze in the dark. That was a truck being driven courtesy of the Alberta government, which has launched an $8 million ad campaign opposing, among other things, the federal government's commitment to net zero, a very aggressive pledge which will have very real consequences for the economy. Now, I don't know how many times that truck was circling the block, but he ended up, it was a male. I'm not being like gender biased here. It was a male driver, ended up at that perfect spot at that perfect moment where we will discuss, among other things, whether the people that need to see that message are listening. Alberta Environment Minister Rebecca Schulz joins us now. Rebecca, great timing on that, by the way. I don't know if you were the ones like with the roadmap saying you got to turn onto Wellington at, exactly 3:02, but it worked.
We obviously didn't give that specific of direction, but I mean, it is an important message for MPs from across the country to see, especially those who are part of the federal Liberal government, because Canadians right across our country, not just in Alberta, but we're hearing this across the prairies in Atlantic Canada, that the draft clean electricity regulations, not only are they wildly expensive, they're completely unrealistic, and they will risk leaving Canadians in the dark. This is completely unacceptable, and that's why we launched this campaign.
One of the challenges here is that this is a campaign that cost a fair bit of money. And I know that when you're dealing with provinces and governments, the budgets are very large, but $8 million, still not insignificant here. Why can you not just pick up the phone and call your federal counterpart? Why can Premier Danielle Smith not just pick up the phone and talk to the federal government the way you'd hope in a federation levels of government communicate and cooperate?
Unfortunately, what we've seen is that the federal government has not listened to provinces, and they certainly haven't listened to electricity providers on essentially why these regulations are so problematic. They say that they consulted, but then when they came out with draft 1 of the clean electricity regulations, like very little, almost none of that feedback that was provided by provinces or our electricity companies was listened to or included. And so, from here, I mean, we are in discussions with the federal government, we as in Alberta, about these specific regulations and other pieces of legislation or regulations that the federal government is looking at that would impact our economy, jobs, and the well-being of Albertans. But specifically here, this is something that will impact all Canadians. And if the federal government, first of all, they've showed that they haven't been listening to the provinces, they haven't been listening to companies. I think that hearing from Canadians is one way that hopefully we can remind them of who we're here to serve and why these regulations cannot go forward the way they've been presented. Albertans, Canadians, they do not want to see their electricity bills go up 3, 4, 5 times, right? The cost estimates are up to $1.7 trillion. Canadians will have to pay for that somehow on their taxes, on their bills. We see other countries around the world. We see also places like California, Texas, Germany, where they are actually facing rolling brownouts, blackouts, rationing power, and going back to coal-fired generation. We don't want that. What we're saying to the federal government is be a partner. Let's have discussions where we put ideology aside and use common sense and put Albertans and Canadians and their very real concerns about affordability and reliability first.
Justin Trudeau yesterday said that Albertans are, quote, all in for what his government is doing on this. Now, I would say, given the narrative that emerged during the last election campaign, in which your UCP got a majority, that Albertans are not all in for the Liberal government's approach to this. But I mean, how do you even reconcile that claim with the experiences that you're seeing from your constituents?
Yeah, it's interesting that they pick and choose facts, and they do misrepresent, I think, the feedback that they've been hearing from especially Alberta power companies. I mean, we've been meeting with companies over the last number of weeks to understand why these regulations are so problematic. A number of those companies and their representatives are actually in Ottawa providing that very real feedback. We saw Minister Guilbeault say, for example, Capital Power is fully supportive. Well, Capital Power also said that they can't do this before 2045. So, I think it's a little disingenuous, to be honest with you. It's not 100% truthful. We know that the way that these regulations are written right now absolutely cannot be implemented in Alberta. And even our independent system operator has raised concerns about grid reliability. And what I break that down to is, I mean, I represent a lot of young families. We have a lot of seniors. When we're talking about rationing power, think about that. In other places, they ration power at areas or times of high demand. So 4 and 9 p.m. When I think about that, I think about families and the people I serve picking up their kids from school, doing homework, trying to have dinner, getting to kids' activities, and doing that in the dark while paying more for less reliable power. I just don't think that that's what anybody wants to see. And, when we look at the criminal code aspects that Minister Guilbeault has suggested, that there will be criminal code essentially sanctions under the Environmental Protection Act for powering our grid. That is a very real problem. And I don't think that that's what Albertans or Canadians want to see.
You mentioned Capital Power, which I think raises an interesting and important point here. Is your issue the timeline? Because the government has been on emissions reduction schemes in general very aggressive, and I think they keep rewriting the timeline and giving the country and the provinces and everyone in it less and less time to do this. But so is that the issue, or is it the fundamental ask underlying it, irrespective of the time frame?
I mean, first of all, of course, this is an area of provincial jurisdiction. So this is another area where the federal Liberal government is infringing on an area of provincial jurisdiction. And I think the big issue here is that they fundamentally do not understand how power generation works in each of the provinces, and they're not treating the provinces as unique. So where we're left is a situation where their prescribed regulations are just, they're completely not feasible for a couple of reasons. One, the technology does not exist. The standards they've put in place have not been tested or proven anywhere in the world. And we would have to develop them, test them, prove them, and scale it up across our whole system in just over 10 years. That is completely unrealistic. The other thing is around the number of hours that we can run peaker generation. So that helps us, especially, think winter. It's cold right across Canada, not just in Alberta, throughout the winter months. Now, if we only have 18 days of peaker capacity where, the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, renewables are not generating the baseload that we need, and you need natural gas peaker capacity to come in and essentially provide that baseload natural gas. 18 days does not get us through the month of January. Mm-hmm. That is wildly unreasonable for, again, not just Alberta, but right across the country. And system operators across the country are saying this just isn't feasible. And so, I hope that this campaign urges on Canadians to tell the feds, tell their MPs why this is so problematic. And, I hope that MPs are looking at those ads, are hearing it on the radio, and then are hearing from Canadians just how concerned they are.
Are you getting support for this from other provinces?
Here's what I would say. We've had provinces right across the country articulate why these regulations are so problematic. I mean, yesterday, not necessarily specific to clean electricity, but the Nova Scotia reports around energy poverty, right? When we talk about energy reliability and energy poverty and why people are at risk because of the federal government's ideological goals. Reading reports of people asking, how do I heat my home? How do I keep my home? How do I put food on the table? How can we afford this carbon tax? That is a problem. I mean, we've seen Ontario's system operator also essentially say that the current draft regulations would be problematic for their grid as well. We've seen it here in Alberta. I know Saskatchewan is opposed. I think a few months ago, Manitoba also had some concerns. And so what we're asking for, I think, as provinces is some common sense. Let's not use ideology. Let's listen to Canadians whose top concerns right now are affordability, the cost of living. Obviously, the carbon tax is driving that to a huge extent, of course, in inflation. But let's listen to those very real concerns and make sure that, when a mom wakes up in the middle of the night with baby, that wasn't, too long ago. I remember what that was like. And could you imagine that mom waking up in the middle of the night and not being able to turn on the lights? Like, that is the reality of what the federal government is putting forward. I am encouraging the federal government, we are here across Alberta, encouraging the federal government to actually think about the Canadians that this would impact, how it would impact them, and what that would mean in their day-to-day lives at a time when cost of living is already a top concern, increased electricity bills for less reliable power. That just isn't something that I think Canadians want to see.
And I think you're very right when you point out how all provinces, and certainly a few in particular, have a shared interest in this. But in terms of going to the extent that Alberta is, maybe not necessarily with an ad campaign, but really asserting provincial jurisdiction here, are you seeing the support from other provinces that you need or would like?
I think that we are. I mean, we hear other provinces across the country saying that this is just unreasonable and unrealistic. I mean, I certainly felt like this campaign was something that was needed to make sure that the federal government is hearing those concerns and that we're focusing on, what's really at the heart of the issue, which is the people that we are elected here to serve and their very real concerns around affordability and reliability. And, I think what we're seeing out of Atlantic Canada, and of course, across the Prairie provinces shows that this isn't just from Alberta. This is an across Canada issue. And it's also why I think the federal government really needs to respect provincial jurisdiction and take the feedback from provinces on what makes their systems unique.
Well, I think the last few years has shown that you can certainly make a point by bringing a truck to Ottawa. Now, you're doing a different type of a truck on Wellington Street there. We had that image. It certainly was noticed by people, whether they'll heed the words on it, and in the radio ads and billboards, time will tell. Minister Rebecca Schulz, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
You as well, anytime.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.